Okay, so we're going to now lay out our grout with our bricks, and our bricks are going to be 4" by 12". Usually your brick size is designated on your renderings because your renderings are done in scale, so you'll be able to measure and know. 4" by 12 is a really standard for TV. I think for theater you can explode them more and make them larger. The grout on this might be a little bit wide, but we're just going to play with it so that you can see what we can do with it. And I'm going to show you a couple different things you can do once we have the initial lay-in of how you can make bricks seem more organic and not so like sharp edged. We're going to do a lot of little things that can help. So we're just going to start out, and I'm going to measure, and then we're going to do some taping. It's going to be very boring for a minute. So yeah.
So while Kim is doing that, I'll talk a little bit about the architectural history of bricks.
Yeah.
Bricks are a size, and they do vary. However, if you think about it, all bricks need to be able to be lifted by one hand and put in place. That's kind of what makes a brick a brick. Then we get into blocks, and blocks are larger, and then they even have what we'll call like cyclopean, which means like cyclops size, like really large bricks that you'd see. Again, those are intended for like a purpose. The 4" by 12", like Kim's talking about, looks great on like courthouses, banks. It's a slightly longer, wider brick, okay, slightly shorter, versus a brick that would look good for like a Boston Back Bay would be something that's probably more a little taller, like maybe 4 1/4 by like 6 7/8. I know those are kind of weird dimensions, but that sort of just evolves from the mold. And if you go to England, they're very specific of their exact type of run and their size. Mm-hmm. And there's all these plants that make their own brick for like 200-300 years. And how it's broken is one of those things. Like I did a show where that was like an integral part of the plot point, where someone had to break a brick on stage. So we had to make sure that the bricks that were painted looked as close as possible to bricks that were going to get broken on stage. So it is a little bit of, even though brick is brick, there's a wide range of brick.
And colors too. I mean, there is beige bricks, there's deep reds, there are purples, there are, depending on what they use for their material.
Exactly. And in this class, I say have fun with it, okay? When I was in grad school, we actually had to find and photograph, and this is the earliest stage of digital photography. So what we would do is borrow like 0.3 megapixel camera. You heard me right, 0.3 megapixel camera. You had to check it out with your student ID because it was like $2,000. And then we went around, and I was in New Haven, Connecticut, with a lot of different bricks, tan bricks, mostly on schools. Where I was at in college was full of like gray kind of bricks. Okay, and I found this one wall, like I feel like it was like North New Haven or something, and it was the purplish brick I've ever seen. So that's what I painted, and because I thought it was fun because it looked like really purple against this kind of brightish gray. Honestly, it did not look good, I will say, in the building. It looked almost a little gaudy, but that being said, as just a wall art piece that then got painted over at the next project, doing the purple was kind of fun. So I recommend, since all of you in your pocket have a better camera than I've ever had in my life, even when I had my big DSR, from the 90s, it's not as amazing as this, go around and find a brick. Okay. I will get some other size tapes so we can make it narrower. All right. A narrower grout line. And so you can kind of don't feel as obligated. Kim is going kind of fast. I would say for your project, try to make it a little bit neater. And I just because it's going to look good. You want it to look good in your portfolio.
Yeah.
She's doing it to show you the process.
Yeah.
And here's another thing.
I always go fast because I've done it a really long time.
Right.
So you don't have to go as fast as speed is not. This is just the speed I go. So don't get
Correct.
Intimidated by it.
And we have, I believe, 2 whole weeks to work on this, if I remember correctly, because marble you're going to be able to do in a day. Marble is really fast. So if you do marble on Tuesday, and you can do it however you want. And then if you do brick the next 3 class days. So this next week and the week after, you'll be in great shape. Is there any advice you can give on doing, like, have you ever did odd bricks, like, in other words, use the same technique for, we'll say, terracotta tile?
Yeah, usually with the terracotta tiles we were doing like a physical texture where you're adding a little joint compound on top of it. So you would actually, again, you would do your brick and then you would do a texture on top. It just depends. I think if it becomes like fieldstone, so if you're looking for something very rough, like in a fieldstone thing, I would actually go against this and say do not tape out because it's too regulated. And instead what I would do is do the reverse of this and do your fieldstone colors first and then come in and just let your hand make different size bricks. So you can have larger, smaller, flatter, wider, and you get that real, like someone just picked a bunch of rocks from their stream and made a wall, such a thing, I've seen that done and it works better that way. So if you're wanting more irregular, more natural looking stone, this may be too regulated. And also when you're taping, something to notice about the tape, especially if you're doing long runs, when you have long flats or they're very wide across or they're very long, the tape will pull to where your pressure is. Okay, so if you're thinking that you just pull a straight line and it's going to go, if I pull this and I pull and your hands on the right or the left, your tape is going to arc and you won't have a straight line. So it's always good to not just do like the top and the bottom. You want to have a midpoint. And if you have a couple people, it's helpful to have multiple hands to help you figure that out.
100%. If you want to tape out your grout with a partner, 100% fine. That I have no problem with that because honestly, you're almost always going to be working with someone else at some point. So if you want to stand on one side and your partner stands on the other side, and then you have even a third person push the middle in, no problem whatsoever. So you do want a tape measure, which probably every single one has from stagecraft class. But if not, I would say pick up, I call it my designer tape measure, which is like the 12 or 16 footer. And then if you really need a 35 footer, get a carpenter.
Yeah, very much so. And then also, when you do this, when you're measuring, make sure you always measure from the same side. So if you're doing top and bottom and you start in the left side, start in the left side over here. Don't go to the right side because your flat may be an inch or so or even a half inch off. And that means your marks are not going to be the same side to side, and you could be off and suddenly you're like looking, you're like, why are my lines crooked? And you keep thinking you've done it right. It's because you measured from one side and the other. If you stay on the same side, as long as it's like I was going this way, you don't have to do it for the next set, but as long as whatever your top and bottom is, your side to side, make sure you're starting at the same point, or you can get off that way very easily just because the flats, as much as we try and build them to specs, there's human error in that, and that can make you a little off. And also when I did my marks, I didn't explain this, but I just eyeballed the center of the mark that I put my tape on. So I chose to split the middle. You could also choose to do the top of the mark is where you put your tape, or the bottom, just whatever you choose your system to be, stick with it. Because if you change, it's going to look weird. And then I'm also going to need a blade because I'm going to have to cut so I'm going to start doing the horizontals now, or at least the first half. I don't know if you guys can see it, but when I hold my tape, if you can tell, my thumb's in the middle of the tape. That's what keeps it from not pulling and not arcing in a weird way. We're also on a smaller flat, but if you guys are doing bigger things, just be aware of it. You'll see it. It'll be really obvious. And you'll be like, what is going on? And you can pull it back up, and then if you pull straight, the tape will straighten out. So it's not necessarily a waste of your product. Mm-hmm. So, looks like I've done something wrong. But what it is you have to offset the bricks now. This is where it can get truly confusing. So, and you can do this where you can mark, but what you'll do now is say this top row is going to be the row that you see, right? You're still going to offset, and usually I offset the half dimension. So this is 12 inches, so we're going to go 6 inches. So every 6 inches, I'm going to make a mark again. And then what I'm going to do with this blade is I'm going to take and I'm going to offset and then add tape where is needed. So it saves your tape for product, and it also helps your eye, because otherwise, if I was then to line 6 inches and decide what I wanted to cut, it's a nightmare in logistics, and you just start going, wait, what have I done? So do it what makes easier, but don't overcomplicate it. You don't have to. So we're going to do the same measurements. We're just offsetting it 6 inches. And I would highly suggest doing numbers, if you can get away with it, for bricks that have an easy half split. Like, don't do 13 inches so that you have to do like, 5.5, or you know what I'm saying? Like, try and do numbers that evenly split, if you can get away with it. Sometimes you can't, but you're in theater, a half inch, a quarter inch, like, as long as it lays out 100%. No one's going to see that. Do you know what I mean? So there's things like that where your designer, like, do what visually looks right, if that makes sense. And give yourself the not having to split eighths and quarters if you don't need to do it for a logistical reason. Okay. All right. This becomes my tedious job too.
Yeah, I will say, as a designer, more than once I've turned in a rendering of bricks, and then they'll do a sample, and they'll change the size to where it's close, and I'll just approve the sample. And that, for me as a designer, that's 100% fine. Okay. And you can already see the proportions of these bricks. Like, this kind of proportion was sort of the brick that I remember in my high school, where it was like a little bit longer and a little bit like it seemed shorter. But and where I grew up, a lot of brick was actually a real tan color, because it was on the Gulf of Mexico. So the brick that they mixed there had like a tannish color, which is, different than you think of the red brick. So I would encourage everyone in the class, have fun with it. Make the brick your brick.
Definitely.
Yeah, make it realistic enough that somebody wants to sneak in and tag it.
And also, that's why I didn't do, you can see how much of the brick, the grout you're seeing. There's so much that's going to be brick. I didn't worry about the brush strokes. Normally, if you were doing something else, you wouldn't want to see that necessarily. But for this process, don't waste your time on something that's when you're going to come back anyways, when we do highlights and shadows.
Yeah, I actually oddly think that sort of adds a texture to it. I don't mean like a physical texture, but to me, and I'll say this again, this is as a designer, when I do a digital rendering in Photoshop, believe it or not, almost nothing is 100% opaque, because what I do is I make things like 95, so that a little bit of the texture of the background bleeds through, and somehow it looks less plasticky, it looks less fake. Yeah. And I think the same is true in scene painting, where sometimes some of the stuff bleeds through and it looks less fake because it doesn't look just as solid.
It's true. And then the gray also marries it a little bit. So you have a little bit of gray in the brick, and it just feels more cohesive for a design. This is the least fun of the project, I'm not gonna lie. The most tedious.
Well, Kim's doing the most tedious part of the project. Can you think of any questions to ask?
Go for it.
So when you first measured it out using the tape measure, and then you're using the tape, do you just split it dead in the center of your line?
Yes. So, and you could choose to snap lines if it's a really long dimension. You could choose to snap because you'll get it, and then you could use that and just split the difference with the tape. I choose to do it because then I know that the bricks are going to be the same top and bottom, and also. And what you could do here is you could then do half of the tape on the top. It depends on how the brick is laid out on your scenery, how you want that to end or begin. So that could depend on the design, because the designer may have it like you would actually never end on grout because realistically you'd have a brick on top. But with the design, it could be anything. So you just want to follow that. So, and that's why I started the lines the way I did. I did a show once where they wanted the brick to fade in and out. So, because they didn't have time for me to brick the entire, it was a theater in the round, but they wanted to have the walls have this idea of this brick coming through. So it was like sections. And then I modeled it and faded it out. So it was that thing of like, I started like this, but then I didn't cover the whole thing. And then I laid it. And then occasionally I would place a brick here and there. And I had a brick stencil that then I would pop a brick here and there to make it look like there was bricks, but it wasn't 100% of a brick wall. So, does that make sense?
So we'll take a pause while Kim finishes this out, and then we'll come back with the next step.